Don't touch anything you don't understand, Daniel Whitmore said without looking up, his voice cutting clean through the low hum of the server room as Eleanor Brooks paused mid-step, her mop gliding to a silent stop across the polished concrete floor, the scent of industrial cleaner hanging faint in the cold, recycled air, while rows of black server towers blinked in steady rhythm like a heartbeat no one ever noticed. And for a moment the entire room seemed to hold its breath as his words. Settled, sharp, and dismissive. Exactly the way people spoke when they were used to being the smartest voice in any room. And Eleanor didn't answer, didn't even look offended. She just lowered her gaze slightly and nodded once as if the words had passed right through her, invisible like she was supposed to be, like she had trained herself to be. Another night shift cleaner in a building that ran on million-dollar decisions and didn't have time for people like her, while Daniel finally glanced over, his tailored jacket catching the sterile blue light, his expression tightening just enough to show irritation. Not anger, never anger, just control. Because control was what built his empire. Control was what kept numbers clean and risks predictable. And right now control meant a perfectly maintained environment for the deal happening 3 floors above. A deal that would close in less than 20 minutes. A deal that depended on everything running exactly as it should, including this room, especially this room. And yet there she was, standing too close to the central rack, her gloved hand hovering inches from a panel marked authorized personnel only. And that was enough to trigger something in him. Something automatic, something practiced. So he stepped forward, not fast, not loud, just precise, and gently but firmly moved her hand aside, not touching her skin, just redirecting the motion like adjusting a misplaced object, and said again, quieter this time. You clean. That's all. And Eleanor stepped back without protest, her movements calm, almost measured, but her eyes lingered for half a second longer than necessary on a small flicker of red buried deep within the grid of green lights. A warning so subtle it could pass for a reflection, a detail most people would miss. A detail Daniel didn't even register as he turned away, already pulling out his phone, already moving on. To the next decision, the next number, the next confirmation. While behind him Eleanor reached for her mop again, dipped it into the bucket, wrung it out slowly, and continued her work as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't seen anything at all, as if the quiet hum of the machines didn't carry attention just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to break. The door to the server room closed with a soft click behind Daniel, sealing in the low mechanical hum as Eleanor continued moving across the floor in slow, steady lines, the rubber wheels of her bucket barely making a sound, while the faint reflection of blinking lights stretched across the polished surface like distant stars. And for a while nothing changed, nothing moved beyond routine. But then there it was again, that flicker, not loud, not urgent, just a quiet inconsistency buried deep in the pattern, a single red pulse where there should have been none, and Eleanor's hand slowed, her grip tightening slightly on the mop handle as she watched it, counting the rhythm without even realizing she was doing it. 1, 2, 3, pause. 1, 2, 3, pause. A pattern that did not belong, a hesitation in the system's breathing, and she glanced toward the empty doorway, making sure no one had come back. Because people like Daniel did not expect anyone else to notice these things, and that expectation created silence, the kind of silence where problems had room to grow. And for a moment she stood there, completely still, her reflection faint beneath her feet, the smell of cleaner sharp in the air, the cold from the machines pressing against her skin. And then she stepped closer to the panel again, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving with the same quiet precision she had used all night, her gloved fingers hovering near the interface as she studied the tiny scrolling lines of system feedback, numbers most people would ignore, signals most people would not understand. But to her they told a story, one she had seen before, one that never started loud, always subtle, always easy to miss until it was too late. And she exhaled slowly, almost like she was deciding something without words, because saying something would mean explaining, and explaining would mean being heard. And being heard required permission she did not have, so instead, she reached forward and pressed a single command. Then another, small adjustments, barely noticeable, a shift in configuration so minor it would not raise suspicion, just enough to stabilize the rhythm, just enough to close the gap before it widened, and the red flicker paused, hesitated, then disappeared into green like it had never existed at all, and Eleanor held her hand there for a second longer, watching, waiting, making sure the system settled back into its steady pulse before she stepped away again, returning to her bucket, dipping the mop, wringing it out, continuing her path across the floor as if nothing had happened, while somewhere above, far removed from the quiet correction that had just taken place, voices gathered around a table, contracts were being reviewed, numbers were being confirmed, and Daniel stood at the center of it all, unaware that something fragile had almost slipped beneath his control, unaware that the silence he trusted had just been interrupted by someone he had already dismissed, and down below the machines kept running, smooth and steady, carrying no sign of what had almost gone wrong. Upstairs the air felt warmer, heavier, filled with quiet confidence and the soft rustle of tailored suits as Daniel stood at the head of the long glass table, his reflection stretched beneath him, sharp and controlled, while a dozen eyes followed his every word, numbers projected across a wall screen in clean white lines, each figure aligning perfectly with the story he had built over months. And for a moment, everything moved exactly as expected, signatures waiting, approval hanging in the balance, the kind of moment where hesitation could cost millions. But Daniel did not hesitate. He never did, because hesitation meant doubt, and doubt was something he had trained out of himself years ago. And yet, as one of the analysts leaned forward, scrolling through the final system verification, something subtle shifted, not loud enough to break the flow, just a pause. A slight narrowing of the man's eyes as he adjusted his glasses and looked again, his fingers tapping the screen twice. Then once more, as if the data in front of him did not quite match what he expected to see. And Daniel caught it immediately, that fraction of a second delay, the way the rhythm of the room faltered, and his gaze sharpened. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone calm but precise, the kind of calm that demanded an answer, and the analyst hesitated, not out of fear but confusion. "No, not exactly. It is just, this should not be stable," he said quietly, pointing to a section of system diagnostics that most people in the room did not fully understand, a cluster of metrics that should have shown fluctuation, instability, something that matched the risk profile they had been preparing for. But instead, everything was smooth, too smooth, like a storm, that had somehow passed without leaving a trace. And a second analyst leaned in, scanning the same data, his brow furrowing. "These numbers were not like this earlier," he added, his voice low enough that only a few people heard. But the effect was immediate, a subtle tightening across the table, a shift in posture, because unexpected stability was not always a good sign. Sometimes it meant something had been altered, something had been touched, and Daniel felt that word settle in his mind like a splinter, touched, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly as he stepped closer to the screen, his reflection overlapping with the data. "Run the log," he said, not raising his voice, not needing to. And within seconds the system history began to scroll, lines of activity moving upward in precise timestamps, each action recorded, each adjustment documented. And at first everything looked normal, routine checks, automated processes, nothing out of place, until the analyst's fingers stopped mid-air, hovering over a single entry, small, almost insignificant, but unmistakably manual. And the room grew quieter, not silent, but close enough that the soft hum of the building itself seemed louder. "This adjustment," the analyst said slowly. "It was not scheduled." And Daniel leaned in just enough to read it himself, his eyes narrowing as he followed the sequence, the timing, the exact moment when the system had shifted from vulnerable to stable. And for the first time that night something unfamiliar flickered beneath his control, not panic, not fear, but recognition. The realization that something had happened outside his awareness, something precise, intentional, and completely unseen. And he straightened slightly, his voice quieter now, almost to himself. "Who authorized that?" But no one answered, because no one knew. And somewhere 3 floors below the machines continued their steady rhythm, holding a secret that had not yet reached the surface. The room did not move, but something inside it shifted as the line of code remained frozen on the screen. A single timestamp quietly challenging the certainty that had filled the space just seconds before. And Daniel stood still, his posture unchanged, but his attention narrowed with surgical precision, his eyes tracing the exact moment the system had corrected itself, the exact second where failure should have begun but did not. And the analyst cleared his throat softly, almost careful not to break the tension. It was executed from within the building, he said, his voice measured. Not remote, not automated. And that detail landed heavier than the numbers themselves because it meant someone had been there, physically present, inside the controlled environment Daniel had built to eliminate variables, and yet a variable had acted anyway, quietly, effectively, without approval, and Daniel exhaled slowly through his nose, not frustrated, not yet, but focused in a way that made the room instinctively hold. Back, track the access point, he said, and fingers moved quickly across screens, pulling up internal logs, security layers, badge entries, all the invisible systems that documented movement inside the building, and one by one the data aligned, narrowing, filtering, removing executives, engineers, authorized personnel, until what remained was smaller, simpler, almost absurd in its insignificance. And the analyst hesitated before speaking again. It came from the lower server level, he said. And Daniel's gaze did not shift, but something in his expression hardened just enough to register the implication. Because the lower level was not where decisions were made. It was where maintenance happened, where things were cleaned, where people moved quietly through the edges of the system without ever being part of it. And the analyst continued, slower now, as if reading it aloud made it more real. Access linked to a temporary badge. And he tapped the screen once, bringing up the identification, a simple name attached to a role most people would overlook without a second thought. And for a moment no one spoke. Because the answer did not fit the structure they trusted, did not match the hierarchy they understood, and Daniel finally stepped back from the screen, his reflection separating from the data as his mind moved faster than the conversation, replaying the timeline, the system, the room below, the quiet presence he had already dismissed, and without raising his voice he said, "Delay the final signature." And that alone was enough to shift the entire energy of the room, not chaos, not panic, but a controlled pause, the kind that only happened when something unexpected demanded attention. And as the others exchanged brief glances, adjusting schedules, recalculating next steps, Daniel was already moving, his phone left behind on the table, his focus no longer on the deal but on the gap in his control, the one he had not seen until now, and the elevator ride down felt longer than it should have. Each floor passing in silence as the faint hum of the building grew louder, deeper, until the doors opened and the cold air of the lower level met him again. Unchanged, indifferent, the same rows of machines blinking in steady rhythm as if nothing had ever been wrong. And at the far end of the room, Eleanor Brooks moved slowly across the floor, her mop gliding in quiet arcs, her posture steady, her presence exactly as it had been before, invisible to anyone who did not know where to look. And Daniel stopped just inside the doorway, watching for a moment longer than necessary, the memory of the log entry still clear in his mind, the timestamp, the correction, the unseen action that had prevented something far larger from unfolding. And for the first time that night, he did not speak immediately, because the certainty he had carried into this room earlier was no longer intact, and the silence between them now felt different, not empty, but waiting. Daniel did not announce himself when he stepped fully into the room, the door closing softly behind him as the cold air wrapped around his tailored coat, the quiet hum of the servers filling the space again like nothing had changed. But to him everything had, because now he was looking differently, not at the machines, not at the polished floor, but at her, the woman moving steadily along the far row, her mop tracing clean lines with quiet precision, her posture unchanged, her presence as calm as before. And for a moment he simply watched, noticing details he had ignored earlier, the way she moved without hesitation, the way her eyes occasionally lifted just slightly toward the racks before returning to her work, the rhythm of someone who was not guessing but knowing, and it unsettled him more than the system log had, because it did not fit into any category he trusted. And finally he spoke, his voice cutting through the hum but softer than before, less dismissive, more measured. "You were here earlier." And Eleanor paused, not startled, just stopping mid-motion as she slowly straightened, her gloved hands resting lightly on the mop handle before she turned to face him, her expression neutral, calm, as if this moment had already been expected. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice steady, not defensive, not eager, just present, and Daniel took a step closer, his eyes searching her face for something he could define, something that matched the data in his mind. "Did you access the system panel?" he asked, direct, precise, the question hanging between them without accusation but heavy with expectation, and Eleanor held his gaze for a brief second before answering. Not immediately, not hesitating either, just choosing her words carefully. "I cleaned around it," she said, and the answer was simple, almost too simple. And for a moment Daniel felt the old certainty return, the instinct to dismiss, to categorize, to move on. But it did not hold, because the log was still there, the timestamp did not disappear, and the stability above had not been coincidence. And he shifted slightly, his jaw tightening as he asked again, this time quieter. "That is not what I asked." And the air between them felt different now, not tense in a loud way, but tight, focused, like a question waiting to be fully seen. And Eleanor's fingers adjusted slightly on the handle, a small movement, almost unconscious, before she replied. "There was something off," she said, her tone even, not trying to impress, not trying to justify, just stating, and Daniel's attention sharpened immediately. "Off how?" he asked, and she glanced briefly toward the servers, her eyes tracing the same place where the red flicker had been. "The pattern was not steady," she said. "It was going to shift," and the words were simple, but they carried a clarity that did not belong to someone guessing, and Daniel felt it, that quiet certainty, the kind that could not be faked, and for the first time since he had walked into the room, he did not interrupt, did not correct, he just listened, and Eleanor continued, still calm. "So I adjusted it," she said, and there it was, no explanation, no apology, just the truth placed between them without decoration, and the hum of the machine seemed louder in the silence that followed, because in that moment the structure Daniel had relied on, the assumptions he had made, the hierarchy he had trusted, all shifted slightly, not collapsing, but bending just enough to let something else through, and he looked at her again, really looked this time, and asked, almost under his breath, "Why did you not say anything?" And Eleanor's answer came without delay, quiet and steady. "You would not have listened." And the words did not accuse, did not challenge, they simply existed, and somehow that made them heavier than anything else she could have said. And Daniel did not respond right away, because for once there was nothing immediate to correct, nothing to control, just the quiet realization settling in the space between them as the machines continued to run, steady, silent, holding the result of a decision he had not made. Daniel did not move for a few seconds after her words settled, the quiet weight of them pressing deeper than any argument could have, and the steady hum of the servers filled the space between them again, unchanged, indifferent, as if the building itself had no interest in who was right or wrong, only in whether it kept running. And he slowly exhaled, not sharply, not in frustration, just a controlled release as his mind recalibrated, shifting away from assumptions he had carried without question, and for the first time that night he found himself looking not at the system, not at the outcome, but at the process he had missed, the moment where someone outside his structure had seen what he did not, and acted without permission, and somehow that action had been the only reason everything above had not collapsed under pressure he had not fully accounted for. And he glanced briefly toward the server racks, their lights steady now, the earlier flicker gone without a trace, and then back to her, still standing there with quiet patience, not waiting for approval, not expecting acknowledgement, just present, and that unsettled him in a way he could not immediately explain, because he was used to reactions, to people adjusting their tone, their posture, their words around him. But she had not done any of that. She had simply acted and returned to her work, and he realized then that her silence had not been hesitation, it had been certainty, the kind that did not need validation, and his voice when he spoke again was different, lower, less sharp. "What would have happened," he asked slowly, "if you had not adjusted it?" And Eleanor did not answer immediately, her eyes shifting briefly toward the machines as if replaying the pattern in her mind. "It would have escalated," she said, calm and direct. "Not right away, but within minutes, the load would have shifted. unevenly, and she paused just slightly, choosing words that remained simple, accessible. It would have caused a failure cascade, and Daniel felt that phrase land, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just precise, and he nodded almost imperceptibly, because he understood exactly what that meant, understood how quickly something small could become something irreversible, how a system built for efficiency could turn against itself under the wrong conditions, and he let that realization sit for a moment before asking. And you knew that just by looking. And there was no challenge in his tone now, only curiosity sharpened by necessity, and Eleanor met his gaze again, steady as before. "I have seen it before," she said, and that answer opened a space that had not existed before, a question without words about who she was beyond what he had assumed, beyond the uniform, beyond the role he had assigned her without thinking, and Daniel's mind moved quickly, connecting fragments, the way she had noticed the pattern, the precision of her adjustment, the confidence in her explanation, none of it accidental, none of it random, and he found himself asking something he would not have considered minutes earlier. Where? And the word came out quieter than expected, and Eleanor's expression did not change, but something in her eyes softened just slightly, not emotion, not vulnerability, just a shift in presence. "Before I came here," she said, and that was all, no elaboration, no details. Just enough to confirm what he was beginning to understand, and Daniel nodded again, slower this time, as the realization settled more fully, not as a shock, but as a correction, a recalibration of something fundamental, and he stepped back slightly, giving her space without making it obvious, and the silence returned once more, but it was no longer the same silence from earlier. It was not built on dismissal, not filled with assumptions. It was quieter, heavier, shaped by something closer to respect, even if he had not said it yet. And Eleanor returned to her work without waiting for anything further, the mop gliding across the floor in the same steady rhythm as before, as if nothing needed to change on her end, as if she had already done what mattered. And Daniel remained where he was for a moment longer, watching, not with authority, not with judgment, but with a new awareness that had not been there when he first walked into the room. The silence stretched just long enough to feel intentional as Daniel finally turned away from the steady rhythm of Eleanor's work, his shoes making a soft, deliberate sound against the polished floor as he walked slowly along the row of servers, his eyes tracing the blinking lights again, but seeing them differently now, not as a system he controlled completely, but as something more complex, something that could still surprise him. And that realization stayed with him as he reached the panel, where the adjustment had been made. The interface quiet, unremarkable, showing no sign of the intervention that had changed everything. And he stood there for a moment, studying it as if the answer might still be visible, as if the system might reveal the exact weight of what had almost happened, but it did not. It only showed stability, clean lines, perfect balance, the kind of outcome he had always expected. And yet now he knew it had not been his doing, and that difference mattered more than he was ready to admit. And behind him Eleanor continued working, her movements consistent, her presence steady, not watching him, not waiting for him to speak again, and that absence of expectation created a space he was not used to occupying, a space where he had to decide what came next without being prompted, without being deferred to, and he slowly reached out, not to change anything, not to interfere, but just to rest his hand lightly against the edge of the panel, feeling the faint vibration of the machines beneath his fingertips, the constant motion that never stopped, and he realized then how close it had come to breaking, how narrow the margin had been between control and collapse, and he pulled his hand back slightly, his jaw tightening not from frustration, but from something closer to recognition, the kind that comes when certainty shifts into something more complicated. And he turned again, his gaze finding Eleanor across the room, and for a moment he simply watched her, the quiet repetition of her work, the way she moved without drawing attention, the way the light reflected faintly off the damp floor behind her, and he understood something else then, something even less comfortable, that she had already moved on from the moment that was still reshaping his understanding, that for her it had been a decision, an action, and then it was done, not a turning point, not a defining event, just something that needed to be handled. And that difference in perspective unsettled him more than anything else, because it meant the significance of what had happened was not shared in the same way. And he took a slow step forward, then another, closing the distance between them again, not with urgency, not with authority, just with intention. And when he stopped this time, his voice carried a different weight, quieter, more grounded. "Eleanor," he said, using her name for the first time, and she paused once more, turning to face him with the same calm presence. And for a brief moment he did not continue, as if the act of saying her name had already shifted something he was still adjusting to. And then he spoke again, slower now, choosing each word with care. "If you had not been here tonight," he said, and the sentence did not need to be finished, because the meaning was already clear, and Eleanor held his gaze, not filling the silence, not completing the thought for him, just letting it exist. And Daniel nodded slightly to himself, as if acknowledging something internal rather than expecting a response, and the space between them remained quiet. But it was no longer uncertain, it was settled in a way that felt new, unfamiliar, but real, and somewhere above the deal still waited. Numbers still aligned, decisions still pending, but down here, in the steady hum of the machines, something else had already been decided, something that did not need signatures or approval, only recognition. Daniel remained still for a moment after speaking her name, as if the sound of it had shifted something deeper than the conversation itself, and Eleanor watched him without expectation, her posture relaxed but attentive, the quiet hum of the servers continuing around them like a steady reminder that time was still moving, that decisions were still unfolding elsewhere. And for the first time since he had entered the room, Daniel felt the weight of that distance, the separation between the controlled environment upstairs and the quiet reality down here, where something critical had already been handled without approval, without recognition, and without hesitation. And he let out a slow breath, his gaze lowering briefly to the floor, catching the faint reflection of the overhead lights and the thin layer of moisture left behind by her work, a clean path cutting through the cold concrete. Precise, intentional, and he realized then that her work had always been like that, consistent, exact, unnoticed unless something went wrong. And the thought stayed with him as he looked back up, his voice quieter now, stripped of the sharpness it carried earlier. "You understood the system," he said, not as a question, but as a recognition forming in real time. And Eleanor tilted her head slightly, not correcting him, not expanding on it, just acknowledging the statement with a small nod. And that small movement confirmed more than any explanation could have. And Daniel felt something shift again, not externally, not visibly, but internally, a recalibration of how he defined value, of who he allowed himself to see. And he took a step back, not retreating, but creating space as he processed the implications. Because if she understood the system, if she could read its behavior with that level of precision, then everything he had assumed about her role, about her place in this environment, was incomplete, and that incompleteness was something he was not used to tolerating. And yet here it was, undeniable, standing in front of him with a mop in her hands, and Eleanor turned slightly, returning to her work without waiting for him to resolve it, her movement steady, uninterrupted, as if the conversation had already reached its natural end for her. And that contrast struck him again, the way she moved forward while he was still catching up, and he glanced once more toward the server racks, the lights blinking in perfect rhythm, no trace of the instability that had almost taken hold. And he imagined the alternative, the cascade she had described, the system unraveling layer by layer while decisions were being finalized upstairs. The consequences, spreading faster than anyone could respond. And he felt a quiet tension in his chest at the thought, not fear, but awareness of how close that scenario had been, and how completely he had missed it. And when he spoke again, his tone carried that awareness, grounded and deliberate. "They are waiting for me upstairs," he said, more to himself than to her. And Eleanor did not respond, not because she did not hear, but because it did not require a response. And Daniel nodded slightly, as if confirming his own next step, before turning toward the door, his hand pausing briefly on the handle. And for a second he looked back, not at the machines this time, but at her, the quiet figure continuing her work in the cold light. And something about that image stayed with him, the contrast between what was seen and what was understood. And then he opened the door and stepped out, the hum fading slightly as it closed behind him. carrying with him a realization that had not been part of the plan, something unaccounted for, something that would not be ignored. And down below, the machines continued their steady rhythm, and Eleanor Brooks moved through the room with the same quiet precision as before, leaving behind a clean surface and a system that no longer trembled beneath the weight it had almost carried. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Daniel stepped back into the warmth of the upper floor. But something about the air felt different now, not because the room had changed, but because he had, and the conversation that had once felt routine now carried an undercurrent he could not ignore. As the analysts looked up immediately, their posture sharpening with expectation, waiting for direction, waiting for confirmation. And for a brief moment Daniel said nothing, his gaze moving past them to the screen where the system metrics still displayed perfect stability, clean, controlled, exactly as they should be. And yet now he knew that perfection had not come from the system alone. It had come from a moment that had never been scheduled, never approved, never even noticed until it was almost too late. And he stepped forward slowly, his reflection returning to the glass surface of the table. But it no longer felt the same, no longer carried the same certainty, and one of the senior analysts spoke carefully. "We are ready to proceed when you are." And Daniel nodded once, his expression composed, but his mind still tracing the gap between what he had assumed and what had actually happened. And he reached for the tablet, glancing over the final numbers again, the projections, the alignment, all of it intact, all of it dependent on a system that had nearly shifted beneath them without warning. And he thought about the cascade Eleanor had described, not as a possibility now, but as something real that had been quietly prevented, and his voice when he spoke was steady, but slower than before. "Proceed," he said, and the room moved instantly. Signatures initiated, confirmations exchanged, the process unfolding exactly as planned. But this time there was a subtle difference, a layer of awareness beneath every step, and Daniel remained still as the final authorization completed. The weight of the decision settling into place, not as a triumph, but as something more measured, something grounded in a reality he had only just begun to see clearly. And when the final confirmation came through, a quiet acknowledgement from across the table, the deal was done, clean, efficient, successful, everything it was supposed to be. And yet Daniel did not react immediately, did not allow himself the usual moment of satisfaction, because he knew the outcome had not belonged entirely to him. And that realization stayed with him as the room began to shift again. Conversations softening, tension releasing, people already moving on to the next thing, the next number, the next opportunity. And he set the tablet down slowly, his fingers resting against the glass surface for a brief moment as he looked once more at the stable system metrics, and then away from them, because the numbers alone no longer told the full story. And he turned slightly, his gaze drifting toward the elevator again, toward the lower level where the hum of the machines continued, without interruption. And he understood then that the most important part of what had just happened would never appear in a report, would never be presented in a meeting, would never carry his name, and that absence felt heavier than recognition ever had. And without announcing it, without drawing attention, he stepped away from the table, leaving the room behind as he moved toward the elevator once more, not out of urgency, not out of obligation, but because something unfinished was waiting below, something that could not be resolved with numbers or signatures, only with acknowledgement. And as the doors closed and began their quiet descent, the hum of the building grew louder again, steady and constant, carrying him back toward the place where everything had almost gone wrong, and where someone he had nearly ignored had made sure it did not. The elevator doors opened again to the cold, steady hum below, and this time Daniel did not hesitate as he stepped out, his pace slower but more deliberate, as if each step carried a weight he had not acknowledged before. And the air felt sharper here, cleaner, untouched by conversation or recognition, just the quiet rhythm of machines doing exactly what they were built to do. And at the far end of the room, Eleanor was still there, her movements unchanged, her presence steady in a way that made time feel different around her, as if nothing above had mattered as much as what had already been done here. And Daniel stopped just inside the doorway for a moment, not observing from a distance this time, but grounding himself in the reality of the space, the faint scent of cleaner, the soft reflection of overhead lights across the damp floor, the subtle vibration beneath his shoes, and then he walked forward, closing the distance again, not with authority, not with urgency, but with something quieter, something more intentional. And when he spoke her name this time, it carried no edge at all. Eleanor. And she paused, turning toward him with the same calm presence, her hands resting lightly on the mop handle, her posture unchanged. And for a second Daniel did not continue, not because he did not know what to say, but because he was choosing how to say it, something he rarely needed to consider. And the silence stretched just long enough to feel real before he spoke again. His voice steady, grounded. The deal went through, he said, not as a declaration, not as a victory, just as a fact placed between them. And Eleanor nodded once. Simple, acknowledging without asking, without needing more. And that quiet response made something in him settle, because it confirmed what he had already begun to understand, that the outcome upstairs did not define the significance of what had happened here. And he took a small breath, his gaze shifting briefly toward the servers before returning to her. It would not have, he added, and this time the meaning was clearer, more direct, and Eleanor met his eyes for a moment, not surprised, not seeking recognition, just present, and he continued, slower now, each word carrying weight, not without what you did. And the words did not come easily, not because they were complicated, but because they required him to step outside of something he had relied on for a long time. And the room remained quiet as he said them, the machines continuing their steady rhythm, the lights blinking without interruption, and Eleanor did not respond immediately, her expression unchanged, but there was a slight shift in her gaze, something softer, not emotion, not relief, just acknowledgement, and she inclined her head slightly. I did what was needed, she said, her voice calm, without emphasis, without pride, and that simplicity carried more weight than anything else she could have added, and Daniel felt it, the difference between recognition and expectation, between acknowledgement and validation, and he nodded once, slower this time, as if accepting something that had already been true before he arrived. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence settling again, but it was no longer uncertain. It was grounded, shaped by what had already been said. And Daniel glanced down briefly, noticing the clean line of the floor where she had just passed, the precise edge between wet and dry. And he understood then that her work, all of it, had always been like this, exact, necessary, and often unseen. And when he looked back up, his voice carried something different, something that did not need to be explained. Thank you, he said, simple, direct, and Eleanor paused just slightly before nodding again, accepting the words without reaction, without change, as if they were not something she had been waiting for, and that made them matter more. And Daniel stood there for another moment, not needing to fill the space, not needing to assert anything further, just allowing the quiet to hold what had already been understood, before he stepped back slightly, not turning away yet, not leaving immediately, because for the first time that night, leaving did not feel like moving forward. It felt like stepping away from something that had just begun to be seen clearly. Daniel did not leave right away, even after the words had settled between them, because something in the moment resisted being closed too quickly, and he stood there for a few seconds longer, the quiet hum of the machines wrapping around the space like a steady breath, grounding everything that had just shifted. And Eleanor had already returned to her work, her movements smooth and unbroken, as if the exchange had not changed her pace at all, as if acknowledgement did not alter the task in front of her. And that contrast stayed with him. The way she moved forward without pause while he remained suspended in the realization of what had already happened, and he turned slightly, his gaze drifting once more across the rows of servers, the lights blinking in calm, consistent rhythm, the system stable in a way that now carried meaning beyond numbers. And he understood then that stability was not always the result of design alone. Sometimes it was the result of someone choosing to act when no one else saw the need. And that thought settled quietly in his mind as he reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his phone, not to check messages or numbers, but to do something he had not planned, something that did not fit into his usual pattern of control. And for a moment he paused, his thumb hovering over the screen, as if confirming the decision before committing to it. And then he made a short call, his voice low, precise, but different from earlier, less about command and more About clarity, I need a full review of the lower-level access logs, he said, and I want clearance adjustments prepared. And he listened briefly, nodding once, before ending the call, slipping the phone back into his pocket without looking at it again. And when he turned back toward Eleanor, there was a subtle shift in his posture, not dramatic, not obvious, but present, something more aligned with the understanding he had just reached, and he walked a few steps closer again, stopping at a respectful distance this time, not closing the space completely, and his voice carried that same measured tone, steady and intentional. This system should have flagged what you saw, he said, more as a statement than a question, and Eleanor glanced toward the servers briefly before answering. It did, she said, simple, and Daniel's attention sharpened slightly. Then why was it not addressed? He asked, and Eleanor met his gaze again, her expression unchanged. Because no one looked long enough, she said, and the words landed quietly, without accusation, without emphasis, but their meaning was clear, and Daniel felt that clarity settled deeper than anything else, because it was not about failure, not about blame. It was about attention, about the difference between seeing something and understanding it. And he nodded slowly, the acknowledgement coming without resistance this time, and the silence returned again, but it was no longer uncomfortable, no longer uncertain. It was reflective, shaped by a shared awareness that had not existed before, and Eleanor resumed her work once more, the mop gliding across the floor in clean, even strokes, while Daniel remained still for a moment longer, watching not out of habit, not out of authority, but out of recognition, and he realized then that this moment, this quiet exchange, would not be recorded anywhere, would not be part of any report or summary, but it would stay with him in a way that numbers never did. And that was something he could not ignore, and after a few seconds he finally turned toward the door, his steps measured as he moved away, but just before he reached it, he paused again, his hand resting lightly against the handle. And without turning back, he spoke one more time, his voice steady, carrying no edge. You should not have to stay invisible here. And the words were not framed as an offer, not yet, but they carried intention, something that had not existed when he first walked into the room. And then he opened the door and stepped out, leaving behind the steady hum, the clean floor, and the quiet presence of someone who had already done more than anyone upstairs would ever fully understand. The door closed behind Daniel with a soft, final sound, and for a moment the room felt exactly as it had before he entered, the steady hum of the servers uninterrupted, the lights blinking in quiet rhythm, the air cool and consistent, and Eleanor remained where she was, her hands steady on the mop as she continued her work without pause, without hesitation. As if the conversation had settled into the same space as everything else that happened here, something acknowledged and then absorbed into motion, and she moved across the floor in smooth, measured lines, the faint scent of cleaner lingering behind her, the surface reflecting the overhead lights in a clean, uninterrupted path. And yet something had shifted, not in the room, not in the system, but in the weight of what had been said, and for a brief moment she paused again, not because she needed to, but because the silence carried something different now, something that lingered just beneath the surface of routine, and her eyes lifted slightly toward the server racks, scanning them out of habit, out of instinct, reading the steady pattern of lights that now held no irregularity, no hidden warning, just stability, and she watched it for a few seconds longer than necessary, confirming what she already knew, that the system was balanced, that the moment had passed, and then she returned to her work, dipping the mop into the bucket, wringing it out with practiced precision, continuing the same quiet rhythm that defined her presence in the room. And above her the building continued to move forward, decisions flowing, conversations shifting, but down here everything remained grounded, simple, consistent, and time passed without announcement, minutes blending into the steady motion of her work, until the distant sound of the elevator reached the lower level again, soft at first, then clearer as the doors opened somewhere behind her, and she did not turn immediately, not out of indifference, but because her focus remained on the task in front of her, the final section of the floor nearly complete, the last stretch of clean surface forming beneath the slow, even strokes of the mop, and footsteps followed, measured, not hurried, approaching with a familiarity that did not belong to routine maintenance or passing staff, and Eleanor finished the motion she was in before she finally paused, lifting the mop slightly and turning just enough to acknowledge the presence behind her. And when she looked, Daniel was standing there again. Not at the doorway this time. Not Daniel stood a few steps closer this time. Not at the edge of the room, not observing from a distance, but within the quiet space that Eleanor had been moving through all night. And the difference was subtle but real, the kind that did not need to be announced, and she met his presence without surprise, her posture steady, the mop resting lightly in her hands as the last section of the floor reflected a clean, uninterrupted surface beneath the cold overhead lights. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the hum of the servers filling the space between them, constant and unbroken, as if marking the passage of something that did not need words to be understood. And then Daniel took a small step forward, his gaze steady but no longer searching, no longer trying to define or categorize, just seeing. And when he spoke, his voice carried that clarity, quiet and grounded. "I had the access logs reviewed," he said, not as an announcement, but as a continuation, and Eleanor listened without shifting, without reacting beyond attention, and he continued, slower now. "What you saw, no one else flagged it." And the words settled without tension, without accusation, just fact, and Eleanor inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the truth without adding to it. And Daniel let out a measured breath, his eyes briefly moving to the servers before returning to her. "That is not something I can ignore," he said, and there was no weight of authority in the statement, only recognition, and he reached into his jacket pocket again, not hurried, not uncertain, and this time when he spoke, his words carried intention that extended beyond the moment. "I want you on the systems review team," he said, direct, clear, the kind of statement that would usually reshape a room, but here it landed differently, quieter, more deliberate, because it was not about position, not about status, it was about acknowledgement made real, and Eleanor did not respond immediately, her eyes holding his for a brief second longer, not questioning, not doubting, just considering. And then she glanced down at the floor, at the clean line she had just completed, the work finished, the surface steady and clear, before looking back up. And her voice when it came was the same as it had been all night, calm, grounded. "I will need time," she said, and Daniel nodded without hesitation, as if the answer had already been acceptable before it was spoken, and the silence returned once more, but it was no longer empty. It was full, shaped by what had been said and what had been understood, and after a moment Eleanor lifted the mop again, setting it gently into the bucket, the motion smooth, final, and she stepped aside slightly, creating a clear path between them, not as a gesture, not as a statement, just as part of her work, and Daniel noticed it, the simple, unspoken shift, and instead of stepping through immediately, he paused, looking at the space, then at her, and for a brief second something softer crossed his expression, not visible in a dramatic way, but present, and then he stepped forward, not over her work, but alongside it, moving carefully, intentionally, as if the space itself carried meaning, and when he reached the door, he did not rush to open it. He rested his hand there for a second, the hum of the machines steady behind him, and then he spoke one last time, not turning back, his voice low but clear. "You did not need a title to prove your value," he said, and after a brief pause he added, "I just needed to see it." And then he opened the door and stepped out, leaving the room as it was, the lights steady, the air cool, and Eleanor Brooks standing in the quiet, her reflection faint on the polished floor, unchanged, uninterrupted, and as the door closed, the system continued to run, balanced, stable, not because it was perfect, but because someone had cared enough to act when no one else did, and that truth remained in the room long after the sound of his footsteps had faded.